Spend just a moment genuinely thinking about empires, and the whole concept starts feeling uncomfortably strange. At some point in history, one group of people looked across a river or mountain range at a completely different group of people who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had lived on their own land for generations, and someone said, "Actually, all of that now belongs to us, and you're going to pay us tribute for the privilege of continuing to exist." And somehow, that became not just acceptable, but the dominant political reality for most humans for the next 4,000 years. For roughly 290,000 of the 300,000 years humans have existed, nobody lived under an empire at all. People lived in bands, tribes, and eventually cities and kingdoms, but the idea that one political authority should control dozens of different peoples across thousands of miles was not merely absent. It would have seemed logistically insane. So how did ancient humans actually invent empires? And perhaps more disturbingly, why did it work? No visionary sat down and drafted the blueprint for multi-ethnic conquest states. Nobody in ancient Mesopotamia held a planning meeting titled Regional Domination Strategy. Instead, empires emerged when several older human inventions, writing, taxation, long-distance roads, professional armies, ideological justification, and administrative brutality collided in a very specific sequence. What actually got invented wasn't just territorial conquest. Humans had been violently seizing their neighbors' land since the Neolithic. What got invented was a system for keeping it. And that required something far more sophisticated than sharp weapons. Before humans could invent empires, they first had to invent a reason why the conquered should stay conquered. To understand how empires emerged, you first need to understand what they replaced. By roughly 3,000 years before the Common Era, the ancient Near East was crowded with kingdoms. Independent city-states like Uruk, Kish, and Lagash in Mesopotamia competed constantly over land, trade routes, and water access. Egypt had unified under pharaonic rule. The Levant, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau all hosted rival political centers. These were genuine states with armies, taxes, laws, temples, and bureaucracies. But crucially, they were ethnically coherent. The people ruled by the king of Lagash were Lagashites. They shared language, gods, and cultural memory. Political authority rested on a foundation of shared identity. Empires broke that pattern entirely. An empire doesn't just expand, it absorbs. It conquers people who do not share the ruler's language, religion, or culture, and then builds systems to extract resources from them indefinitely. That's a genuinely different political organism from a kingdom, and it required different tools to function. Archaeologist Norman Yaffe, in a 2005 study on early Mesopotamian state formation, noted that the shift from city-states to territorial empires involved not merely military expansion, but entirely new forms of political imagination. It wasn't enough to defeat your enemies anymore. You had to govern them afterwards, often for centuries, while they still remembered being independent. That's a much harder problem than it sounds. The first person to seriously attempt solving that problem was a man named Sargon of Akkad, who ruled between approximately 2334 and 2279 before the Common Era. We know frustratingly little about Sargon's early life. Later Mesopotamian legend claimed he was born to a humble priestess and raised by a gardener, but that origin story is so archetypal it almost certainly served political purposes rather than historical accuracy. What we do know is this: Sargon rose to power in the city of Kish, then conquered the dominant Sumerian cities to the south Uruk, and Lagash, and kept going. His forces reached the Mediterranean coast in the west and possibly the Persian Gulf in the east. Inscriptions claim he conducted 34 military campaigns. Whether that number is literal or symbolic remains debated, but the scale of his ambition was unprecedented. More importantly, Sargon didn't just raid and leave. He stayed. He installed governors loyal to him personally, many drawn from his own Akkadian-speaking people, to administer conquered Sumerian cities. He standardized weights and measures across regions that had previously operated independently. He required tribute payments sent back to his capital at Akkad, a city archaeologists still haven't definitively located. And crucially, he used Akkadian as an administrative language even in areas where it wasn't natively spoken. This was new. Sargon had invented the infrastructure of empire. But here's the complication. It didn't last. The Akkadian Empire survived roughly 180 years before collapsing amid rebellion, invasion, and possible climate stress. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, famously declared himself divine, wearing a horned crown reserved for gods on his monumental victory stele now held in the Louvre. That claim didn't prevent his empire from crumbling shortly after his death. Empires, it turned out, were easier to build than to sustain. And that's where the truly interesting inventions began. If the idea that empires required invention rather than just military strength surprised you, stay with this. Because the part where humans figured out how to make conquest permanent is considerably darker. and far more relevant to the world we currently live in than you'd expect. And if you're interested in how power itself actually works beneath the official story, go ahead and subscribe now, because we're about to dig into the specific mechanisms that turn temporary domination into multi-generational control. The civilization that perfected imperial administration rose in northern Mesopotamia nearly 1,000 years after Sargon. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which reached its height between roughly 911 and 609 before the Common Era, developed systems of control so effective that later empires, including Rome and Persia, borrowed them wholesale. The Assyrians are frequently remembered for military brutality, and their own royal inscriptions don't exactly discourage that reputation. King Ashur-nisir-pal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, left records boasting of flaying rebellious leaders alive, impaling populations, and building pyramids of severed heads outside conquered cities. But focusing purely on violence misses the genuinely innovative parts. Terror was a tool, not the system. What made Assyria an empire rather than just a vicious kingdom was infrastructure. They built the ancient world's most extensive road network, allowing messages to travel from the capital at Nineveh to the provinces in days rather than weeks. They developed a sophisticated postal relay system. They kept meticulous written records. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from the Royal Library at Nineveh, excavated by Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s, reveal an empire obsessed with information. Tribute lists, loyalty oaths, intelligence reports, diplomatic correspondence, and astronomical observations. Historian Karen Radner, in her 2014 analysis of Assyrian provincial governance, emphasized that the empire's real strength lay in its ability to know what was happening in distant territories and respond rapidly. Rebellions could be detected early through informant networks. Famines could trigger grain redistribution. Governors who skimmed too much tribute could be replaced before the province collapsed. The Assyrians also pioneered mass deportation as policy. When they conquered a region, they frequently relocated entire populations, moving skilled workers, elites, and potential troublemakers thousands of miles from their homelands. This wasn't random cruelty, it was social engineering. Transplanted how populations lost their local support networks, couldn't organize resistance effectively, and were forced to depend on imperial administration for survival. Empires the Assyrians understood were information problems as much as military ones. The empire that refined these tools into something genuinely sustainable emerged from what is now Iran. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BCE and lasting until Alexander's conquest in 330 BCE, became the largest political entity the ancient world had yet seen, stretching from the Indus Valley to Egypt to the edges of Greece. What made Persia different was surprisingly simple. They stopped pretending everyone should become Persian. Earlier empires had typically imposed their language, gods, and customs on conquered peoples. Persia tried something else. Cyrus famously allowed the exiled Jewish population in Babylon to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Persian kings claimed titles in multiple languages. King of Persia, King of Babylon, Pharaoh of Egypt. Local religions were tolerated, even sponsored. Satrapies, the empire's provincial divisions, retained substantial local autonomy as long as tribute flowed and rebellion didn't. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact discovered in 1879 and now held in the British Museum, contains a declaration sometimes called the First Charter of Human Rights, though that label is considerably more modern than the object itself. What it actually demonstrates is propaganda sophistication. Cyrus presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator restoring proper religious order. That's exceptional branding. Persia also professionalized imperial communication further still. The Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Sardis to Susa, allowed mounted couriers to deliver messages across the empire in roughly a week. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, marveled at the system. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their designated stages with utmost speed. That line, incidentally, now appears on a New York City post office, which tells you how durable good infrastructure ideas actually are. But tolerance had limits, and those limits were economic. Persian administration excelled at taxation. Darius I reorganized the empire into 20 satrapies, each assigned a fixed annual tribute calculated in silver. That standardization allowed long-term planning impossible under earlier, more haphazard extraction systems. The real Persian innovation was this. They made empire feel less like occupation and more like membership in a functional system. For many conquered populations, Persian rule brought stability, roads, dispute resolution, and protection from rival powers. That's a much harder arrangement to rebel against than simple military domination. Empires became sticky once they started delivering services. But roads and record-keeping alone couldn't explain why millions of people across thousands of miles accepted foreign rule for centuries. At some point, empires needed a story. This is where religion and imperial ideology became genuinely inseparable. Persian kings claimed divine favor from Ahura Mazda. Assyrian monarchs presented themselves as chosen by Ashur to bring order to chaos. Roman emperors eventually declared themselves divine outright. Chinese emperors ruled under the mandate of heaven, a concept so politically useful it lasted millennia. These weren't mere decorative claims. They were load-bearing beliefs. If an emperor rules by divine will, rebellion isn't just illegal, it's blasphemy. If the empire represents cosmic order, resistance becomes tantamount to supporting chaos. That's a significantly harder justification to argue against than our army is bigger than yours. Empires also develop visual propaganda at scale. Monumental architecture announced power to anyone who could see it. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon, reconstructed partially in Berlin's Pergamon Museum from original glazed bricks, stood nearly 40 feet high, covered in bright blue tiles and relief sculptures of dragons and bulls. Walking through it wasn't merely entering a city. It was experiencing political power made architectural. Inscriptions functioned similarly. The Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in what's now western Iran by order of Darius I around 15 BCE, presents the king's official version of his rise to power in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It sits 300 feet above the ground. Nobody could read it without serious effort. That was the point. The inscription announced that imperial authority extended even into vertical rock faces. Empires didn't just control territory, they controlled the landscape itself. Here's the uncomfortable part of this story. Empires didn't succeed purely through violence or propaganda. Sometimes they succeeded because, for certain people at certain times, they genuinely worked better than the alternatives. A merchant traveling from Egypt to Mesopotamia under Persian rule could use standardized roads, rely on imperial garrisons for security, and conduct business using recognized coinage. Under a fragmented system of warring city-states, that same journey might require navigating a dozen different toll systems, currencies, and legal codes while dodging bandits and armies. For local elites willing to collaborate, empires offered opportunities unavailable in smaller polities. A talented administrator from a conquered province could rise to genuinely high positions in Persian or Roman bureaucracy. That social mobility was real, even if the system enabling it rested on conquest. And for populations facing external threats, incorporation into an empire could mean survival. Better to pay Persian taxes than be conquered by a rival power with worse terms. Historian Jane Burbank and legal scholar Frederick Cooper, in their 2010 comparative study of empires across history, argued that successful empires managed difference rather than eliminated it. They created systems where multiple ethnic groups, religions, and legal traditions could coexist under a single political authority without constant assimilation pressure. That's a genuinely difficult political achievement, even if the underlying power structure remained deeply unequal. None of this makes empires benevolent. Conquered peoples rarely chose incorporation freely. Rebellions were crushed with extraordinary violence. Entire populations were enslaved, deported, or exterminated. The fact that empires sometimes delivered stability doesn't erase the foundational fact that they were built on subordination. But if we're trying to understand how empires actually functioned rather than simply condemning them, we have to acknowledge this tension. They were simultaneously protection rackets and providers of genuine services. That paradox made them remarkably durable. Once empires existed, they created a genuinely difficult problem for everyone else. How do you survive in a world where your neighbor just conquered everyone within 500 miles? The answer frequently was to build your own empire first. This created an arms race effect. States that didn't expand risked being absorbed by those that did. Peace-oriented kingdoms found themselves competing against polities organized entirely for conquest. Over time, the structure of empire replicated itself not because every society wanted to become imperial, but because imperial systems outcompeted alternatives in a world that already contained empires. That's a darker origin story than individual ambition. It suggests that empires became, in some contexts, structurally necessary for survival within an imperial world system. This pattern repeated across civilizations with no direct contact. China developed empire independently. So did the Inca in South America, who built the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas using systems, road networks, centralized administration, tribute extraction, and resettlement policies that parallel Assyrian and Persian innovations, despite zero cultural connection. Anthropologist Henry Wright and archaeologist Gregory Johnson, in a 1975 comparative study of early states, noted that complex administrative hierarchies appeared repeatedly across unrelated civilizations, once populations and territories reached certain thresholds. Empire, in this view, wasn't merely invented. It was almost structurally inevitable once human societies reached sufficient scale. That's an unsettling thought. It implies that certain forms of domination emerge not from individual evil, but from organizational logic. The Assyrian Empire collapsed in 609 BCE. The Achaemenid Persian Empire fell to Alexander in 330 BCE. The Western Roman Empire fragmented by 476 CE. Every ancient empire eventually failed, but the systems they invented outlived them entirely. Modern nation-states still use roads, postal systems, standardized currencies, professional bureaucracies, taxation districts, written legal codes, and identity documents. Every single one of those technologies was refined inside ancient empires as tools for controlling conquered populations across distance. We still live inside infrastructure originally designed for domination. The concept of citizenship itself emerged from empire. Rome extended legal status to conquered populations as a mechanism of incorporation, creating gradations of belonging that allowed millions of people to identify with a political system built on conquest. That idea never really went away. It just changed names. Even modern international systems reflect imperial logic. Borders drawn by European empires still define African and Middle Eastern states. Economic structures developed during colonial rule still shape global trade. The language you're hearing right now became globally dominant because the British Empire imposed it across a quarter of the planet, and American geopolitical power maintained that dominance afterward. Empire didn't disappear, it became ambient. So how did ancient humans actually invent empires? Not through one dramatic conquest or single strategic genius, but through thousands of years of accumulated refinement. Mobility and communication technology made distant control possible. Writing made administration scalable. Professional armies made conquest sustainable. Ideological systems made domination feel divinely ordained. And infrastructure made resistance costly enough that acceptance became, for many people, the rational choice. What ultimately got invented wasn't merely the ability to conquer. Humans had always been capable of violence, but the ability to make conquest feel permanent, normal, and eventually invisible. The strangest part about empires is that we still haven't fully escaped the assumption underneath them, that it's reasonable for one political authority to control vast territories containing millions of people who never consented to that arrangement. We've replaced emperors with nation-states, divine mandates with constitutions, and satraps with governors. But the basic architecture, centralized authority extracting resources from distant populations through professional bureaucracy, remains instantly recognizable to anyone from ancient Assyria. So the next time you use a highway, mail a package, pay taxes to a distant capital, or show identification at a border, remember what you're actually participating in. Not the invention of one ambitious emperor, but the invention of systems so successful at organizing human societies that we forgot they were ever invented at all. That's how empires won. Not by lasting forever, but by making their tools seem inevitable.